Well, now my role in the Feast of Tabernacles seems to have become putting the feast theme back in its context. I'm a contextual Bible teacher, and I love looking at the context. The phrase families of the earth is taken from Genesis 12, and it's 1/5 of one verse in that passage. So I'm going to read the passage to you, and then we'll talk about it. The Lord had said to Abraham, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse those who curses you. And all peoples on the earth will be blessed through you." So Abram left as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he went out from Haran. He took his wife Sarah and his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh in the land of Shechem. The Canaanites were then in the land, but the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. The question I want to answer is, what does this passage, this context, tell us about the Lord? Because that's the only point of reading the Old Testament, to tell us about the Lord and make us familiar with his character. This context is a key passage. It's a key moment in the history of the human race. It's the beginning of God's rescue of our race from itself. The conversation, however, is not two-way. Abram did all the listening, and God did all the talking. And that's the first thing we notice about the Lord God. He's a God who speaks. This is the God who made the universe, who flung the stars into their orbit, and he's talking to a creature, a man. And that's the first thing about God that we rejoice in, that God is a God who speaks. That's how the universe came to be, because God did a lot of talking. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And the whole universe came to be because our God is a God who talks, who speaks. And of course, Abram was a man who heard and who listened. And that's the other side of it. You only hear God speak if you're listening to him, listening for his word. Second thing I want to say about God is that he has a name. The name here is Lord in capital letters, but that stands for his Hebrew name, JHVH was his name, No vowels, just consonants. The tetragrammaton, as it's been called. And the English turned that into Jehovah. Guide me, O thou great Jehovah. That's what they used in the Victorian hymns. It's gone out of fashion ever since the Jehovah's Witnesses took the name, even though they've got it wrong. JHVH, how do we pronounce that? I yet have to persuade a Jew to pronounce it for me. I say, how do you say the name of God? And they say, yeah, oh, just a minute, you're not going to catch me. And they just shut up. J in Hebrew is pronounced like a Y in English, and V is pronounced like a W. So the nearest I can get to it is Yahweh. But the significance of that name is this: it distinguishes our God from every other God who ever existed. He has a name, as every one of us has a name that distinguishes us as a person from everybody else. I'm sorry we don't use his name more often. I'll make a confession now. I once asked the Lord when I was praying, Lord, please give me an English word that would correspond to Yahweh in Hebrew. It's a participle of the verb to be, and he, like lightning, put a word into my mind which was thrilling. The word was always. God is always. And he has a lot of other names, surnames. God is always our helper. God is always our rock. God is always our Redeemer. Always. What a lovely name for God. And his Son has an equally lovely name, Yes. He's given that name in the New Testament. He is the yes to every promise of God. And with a God called always and a Son called yes, we could hardly have a more positive faith. What else do we find about God? He is a commanding God. He has a right to be. He created us. He has a full right to tell us what to do, how to live. He makes our laws, which are for our good, but he makes them. He is a commanding God. And he said, Abram, that was his name at first, Abram, go to a land that I will show you. Leave your father's household, leave your people, leave your land, leave everything behind and go. Now, Abram was 75 years old when God told him that, and he left a brick-built house with nice fireplaces, and I showed my wife a photograph of a brick-built house, 2 stories, in Ur of the Chaldees, which is where Abram lived, and I showed her a photograph of a fireplace in that house. I said, what do you think about that? She said, it's a little old-fashioned for me. I said, it ought to be. It's 4,000 years old and more. But she was very taken with the fireplace. It was actually quite a lovely fireplace with a mantelpiece, everything. And God said, go, leave it all behind. And Abram lived in a tent for the rest of his life. At 75, left a comfortable, well-warmed, brick-built house, ideal for retirement, and lived in a tent up in their hills. It's an amazing act of obedience. And without it, none of us would be here today. I'm looking forward to meeting him and thanking him for going. What else can we find out about God? God is a God of history. Only a God who can control history can promise to make a great nation of someone and give them a great name. And God has kept that promise. He's done it. The name Israel is known worldwide. Everybody knows the name Israel now. And God has made a great nation in which we live at the moment. What else? God is a God who blesses people. That means to do them good, to make provision for their need, to protect them when they're attacked, to be good to them, to bless them. And he promised to bless Abraham, and through him to bless everybody else. That's a big promise. And God is a God who blesses people. Now I come to the other side of that, the downside of it. God is a God who curses people. This I'm going to say much more about tomorrow, because many people think that God cursing people is only in the Old Testament. And I want to show you it's right through the New Testament too. But modern man doesn't like that. He wants a God who blesses. And I'm afraid it shows up even in the choruses we sing. Bless me, bless me, bless me. I don't know of a chorus that sings about God cursing me. But he does. And he will. And here he ties his reputation to Israel and says, if you bless Israel, I'll bless you. If you curse Israel, I'll curse you. He is a father of Israel, a father talking about his children and saying, what you do to my children, you do to me, and I will do to you. Cursing is to speak harmfully about people, to damn them for the future. And it's a true fact that every nation, every empire that has risen up against this little land of Israel has been cursed by God into oblivion. It happened to the Assyrians, it happened to the Babylonians, it happened to the Greeks, it happened to the Romans, and it's happened to the British. In 1948, we washed our hands of this little nation and said we're not going to do anything more with it. In fact, I know that Winston Churchill, just after the war, wrote to Chaim Weizmann, the president of Israel, and said, I want nothing more to do with you Jews. And within a fortnight, he disappeared from politics. And people said, what happened to Winston Churchill? He brought us through the war. And now we've kicked him out. But in 1948, Britain said, who had been given the mandate to look after this country for God, and we pulled out of it. And within 5 years, the British Empire had gone, apart from a few little outposts like Gibraltar and the Falkland Islands. Do you know that in my lifetime, 6 British prime ministers have disappeared from politics within weeks of breaking a promise to this little country? It's a fascinating tale, but God has kept the promise to bless those who bless this country and to curse those who curse it. Next, I note that he's a very patient God. He is making a covenant with Abraham. He is making a marriage. But the marriage service lasted 25 years until he had spelled out to Abram all the promises that he was making. The promise of descendants to a man then in his 90s, with a wife just a little younger, and promising a baby boy. So much so that Sarah, Abram's wife, laughed. She thought, that's a joke. Me at my age having a baby. And she'd been barren all her life. I'm very struck by Genesis 11, which says, so-and-so begat so-and-so, and he begat so-and-so, and he begat so-and-so. And they seemed to do nothing but begat in those days. And they went on begatting until suddenly it says, but Sarah was barren. And the whole thing would have come to an end. It would require a miraculous birth. But since Sarah thought it a joke, that's what they called the baby boy when he came, joke. Or Isaac, Hebrew for laughter. What a name to saddle a boy with. But he got the boy. And then God said, and now I want you to kill him. Take him up to Mount Moriah. You know where that is. It's just half a mile from here. Take him up and kill him as a sacrifice for me. Now I can imagine them walking up that hill, and the boy said, Father, you've got the wood for the fire, but where's the sacrifice? And at some point, that poor father had to say, you're the sacrifice. And he submitted to it, meekly, in the very place where later, years later, centuries later, a heavenly son would submit to a heavenly father with a crown of thorns. And Abraham, when God said, no, I was just testing you, don't kill your son. He's your future. And then God said an amazing thing, the implications of which I've never yet sounded. It's a deep, deep saying. God said to Abraham, now I know that you fear me. Those three words, now I know, take them at face value because God means what he says. He didn't know until then. He was not sure of Abraham until then. But now I know that you fear me. That's a great statement of God. And it has implications for God's knowledge of the future. But I won't go into that. A patient God. It took 25 years to marry Abram and to complete the promises. And then look how many years he took to fulfill them. He promised not only descendants, he promised a land for them, the land in which we now reside. And he gave the exact boundaries of that land. Listen, I just want to remind you that the Jews have not come back to Israel yet. Half of them are back. But there's another half out there, mainly in America, but a good number in Britain and elsewhere around the world. God has still to bring half of them back. And when they've got back, they've only got a third of the land, the territory that God promised Abram. So God has a lot more to do to bring Israel home. And a lot of Christians talk to me as if the Jews are back. They've been coming back since 1875, and only half of them are back already. So God has a long way to go. He could do it very quickly, but he still has a lot to do to bring them all back and to give them what he promised them. But God is a very patient God. He can wait centuries. 1,000 years are like a day to him, so it's only been a couple of days since Jesus was here. To God, time is relative to him, and he is an eternal God. But he was a patient God, and he is a caring God, because he's concerned about the people he has made. His concern is not just for Abram. His concern is for the families of the earth. He's concerned about everybody. But his concern will reach them through Abraham and his descendants and those like ourselves who look to him as our Father. God cares about the people he's created, and he wants to bless them too through Abram's family. Now that's what the philosophers call the scandal of particularity. Let me spell that out. What they mean by that is this. My wife and I had 3 children. One is in heaven now, and the other 2 we're celebrating with on Saturday. Now, when they were young, I used to sometimes on a Saturday bring them candies or sweets. And I could choose one of 2 ways to bless them with candy. One way was to give a bag of sweets to one of the 3 and say, share that with the others. That didn't always make for peace. It didn't always spread shalom around the family. The other way was to give them 3 bars of chocolate, 1 each. And that way brought peace and harmony. But that way is not God's way. The scandal of particularity means that God says, I will choose one nation and bless everybody else through that one nation. He didn't send an American Messiah to America, or a Russian Messiah to Russia, or an Indian Messiah to India. He chose the Jew, and through him, he had to share the goodies with everybody else. And that has caused resentment, jealousy, all kinds of wrong attitudes among the peoples of earth. It has caused anti-Semitism. It caused a lot of feeling. The scandal of particularity is just this, that every nationality, if it wants the truth that sets us free, must go to the Jewish nation for it. Isn't that amazing? Jesus, my Jesus, was, is, and always will be a Jew. My Bible is full of Jewish writing. Everything I value most, I owe to the Jewish people. And that's how it is for every other nation. Until a nation swallows its pride and comes to this nation, they will not know the truth. They will not have salvation. So God works on the principle of the scandal of particularity. And he chooses one nation not for their sake, but for the sake of everybody else. And he's chosen a land for them at the very heart of the earth. If you cut out the landmass of the world, it's all on one side of the globe. The Pacific Ocean is on the other side. And if you cut out all the landmass, but just leave little bits joining the continents together, and then find the center of gravity with a pin, where it all balances around the center and revolves around it, you'll find that pin is through this city. And God chose this city at the center of the known world to spread the good news. That's the calling of the Jewish people, and they have never fulfilled it yet. One day they will, I believe. And what a day that'll be, when two well-dressed young Israelis knock at your door and you think they're Mormons, and they're not, they're Israelis wanting to share the truth with you. What an impact that would have on the entire world. I just speculate on that. Well, these are some of the things I learned from this context about God. And I want to spend tomorrow morning telling you that the God who curses is the God of the Old Testament all the way through, which ends with the word curse. But he's also the God of the New Testament, which also ends with a curse. And we'll see that we don't play games with God. We take God seriously, because he takes us seriously. And I now look at the other person involved in this passage, Abram. What do we find out about him that might tell us the sort of people that God speaks to? And the first is this: he was an older man. Our world is now worshiping youth. Our churches' worship is modeled on youth concerts. We are young-oriented, but God isn't. Thank God, God has room for people like me. I'm 86. I'm 86, fighting cancer, and still God seems to have some use for this old codger. Praise be. Abram was 75 when God first spoke to him, and he obeyed. The good thing about this man, Abram, was that he obeyed. He became the father of many nations, not just many people, people as common as the sand on the seashore and the stars in the sky, of which he could see 6,000 in his day. We now know that there are millions. And God, who created them, said, your descendants will be as the stars. Go out and sit outside your tent and look at them. Count them if you can. Those will be your descendants. And here we are in this room today, and we look to Father Abraham. He was not only elderly, but he was wealthy. And that's maybe a surprise to you. He didn't go straight to the land of Canaan. He got as far as Haran, which is up the Euphrates River towards the source. And there he settled for a time and prospered developed flocks and men servants, and became quite a wealthy man. God doesn't despise wealth when it's in the hands of a man as obedient as Abram. He doesn't just favor the poor, though thank God he does. What else do we find out about Abraham? He recognized God's voice. And that takes some doing, because the way God speaks, most people miss it. Someone needs to have been practiced in listening to God and hearing what he says. And Abram was a listener. I've already mentioned that he obeyed God. He got as far as Haran, but he said to everybody at Haran, "This is not God's will. I've got to go further. I've got to go up the mountains, and there are no mountains here. This is not my destination." And he made up his mind to go further and further until he got to the place that God wanted him to have. I have stood at the tree in Shechem, which may not be the actual tree that he sat under, but it's in the very place. And it's interesting that God said, all that you can see, I'm going to give you. And from that tree, you can see the whole of what the world says is occupied territory. You can see the whole of what Palestinians say is theirs. And God says, I will give it to you. It was his to start with, so he could give it to them. What else do we know about Abram? We know that he was uncompromised because he would not stay with everybody in his family at Haran. He was a devout man. Wherever Abraham pitched his tent, he built an altar. That's very interesting. A tent is a very temporary place, but an altar is built with stone, and it's there even when you've upped your tent and gone. And wherever Abraham went, he pitched his tent and built an altar. So he was a devout man. He was a generous man. He took Lot with him, which I think was probably a big mistake, and it would come back on Abraham when he had to fight, literally fight physically for Lot's safety. But nevertheless, he was generous. And when he got into the promised land, he said, Lot, you and your flocks and your men, you can take your pick, and I'll have what you don't want. That's a pretty generous offer for an uncle to make to his nephew. And Lot looked down into the Jordan Valley and saw how fertile it was, how well watered, just right for his flocks. And he said, I'd like to go down there. And he went down towards the Dead Sea. And we know what happened later. Now, what a heritage we have. Our heritage is this very conversation. It is the covenant or marriage that God made. He took the initiative. He made the promises. That's what a covenant is. A contract is an agreement between two parties, each of whom has something the other needs, and they bargain with each other until they sign a contract. You want to build a house? The builder has material, staff, machinery, everything that you need. And you have money which he needs for himself and to pay his staff. And so eventually you decide how much it will cost, how long it will take to build, and you both sign a contract. It's a bilateral agreement. But I finish with this thought. Don't ever try to bargain with God. Don't ever try to have a contract with God. You can have a covenant which He spells out and which you can either accept or refuse, but you can't change. A covenant is like making a will, a last will and testament. That's the same word as covenant. And you decide where your money and property will go when you die, and it's your decision. And the legatee, the person named in your will, can either accept or reject it, but they can't alter it. It's your testament, your covenant. And God made this covenant with Abraham, which we enjoy and from which we benefit. And I think that's enough for today. Because, am I right? 3/4 of them. And tomorrow we'll look at how God's curses cover the whole of Israel's history and will ultimately decide our destiny. Thank you for listening.